when I speak to private companies, I tell them that now is the time to seriously consider previous practices on lobbying and to think always about what is the common security interest. Thank you, Davor, and thank you, Jack, for the kind words for my country. It has been a pleasure and an honor to participate in events by the Institute of Cultural Diplomacy, and I have talked extensively about Moldova, about issues that Moldova is facing in terms of security, in terms of disinformation. But today we are at the Berlin Economic Forum, and also, as you mentioned, we have a selection of speakers from Moldova. So I decided to concentrate on something that matters a lot for Moldova, and that is geoeconomics. We live in extraordinary times. I don't like to quote Lenin, but there is a quote that is attributed to him that says, there are decades where nothing happens, and then there are days where decades happen. He didn't quite say that, but something similar. And I think you, just as me, wake up every day and think, well, what other news will we get, and then how will this influence not just the region that matters for Moldova, Eastern Europe, but how does this influence the world order and sort of the geopolitical and geoeconomic alignment all throughout the world. And we actually had here speakers speaking about education. I completely agree. And then we had some information about Moldova and the financial sector. I have the privilege of having been both State Secretary of Education and Minister of Finance. And I relate to sort of both sectors very much. But then as Prime Minister, I've had to deal mostly with crisis management and geopolitics and geoeconomics. So actually, I want to concentrate on industrial policy and what it means for the security and the strategic independence of Europe. I realize that me and our next esteemed speaker, State Secretary Kistol from Moldova, stand between you and lunch. So I will try to concentrate on the forward-looking recommendations. So when I was growing up and learning economics, I don't know about you, but industrial policy was seen as sort of a no-no. We sort of believed in, build the fundamental institutions for a market economy, and then they will come, like in that movie by where Kevin Costner says, build it and they will come. But then actually countries never stopped doing industrial policy. And, we have seen a lot of sort of active involvement in key strategic sectors by different countries. So, and we've seen this grow tremendously after COVID, right? So Inflation Reduction Act, and then we saw decisions in the EU, and, we see China and decisions on industrial policy that have been very active and very effective, I should say. And so actually people started waking up to the fact that it is a reality that states, and when I say industrial policy, I don't mean just industry, right? I mean sort of decisions of the state to support a specific sector of the economy or specific products or a specific innovation. And so we saw sort of a recognition that industrial policy matters, but then we also saw a recognition that this will grow. And so in 2023, actually last year, I think, the IMF released its first analysis on industrial policy interventions, and it found something like 2,600, so 2,600 industrial policy interventions just in 2023 by different states, and half of them were in the US, China, and the EU. And then, you know, if you look at the rationale of these interventions, then, you know, some were driven not by sort of, or most were driven not by traditional objectives like competitiveness, but rather new objectives, first and foremost, security, but also green and digital transitions, supply chain resilience, and then, you know, geopolitical and sort of strategic considerations. So if we look at the EU, for example, then, you know, we had the new industrial strategy for Europe in 2020. We had the 2023 European Chips Act. We had the Net Zero Industry Act, the Critical Raw Materials Act, the Strategic Technologies in Europe platform. And these are just some of the sort of regulations that have a very clear industrial policy objective. And so, you know, we have seen, as I said, this COVID-19 pandemic influence approach on industrial policy, but then very quickly we saw how the Russian invasion of Ukraine also sort of made countries double down on these industrial policy decisions. So we've seen decisions to ensure energy security and reducing dependency on Russian fossil fuels, then defense capabilities, improving defense capabilities, leading to the first ever European defense industrial strategy, digital sovereignty, access to critical raw materials, and then semiconductor production. So now, what happened in the last 6 weeks? We saw not only sort of a traditional industrial policy, what we saw is just, you know, raw exercise of economic power and not only. And so we know about the tariffs in specific sectors, like steel or others, but we also saw the tariffs on specific countries. I think today we have a round of tariffs entering into force on Canada, on Mexico, and I think a second round on China. And what we are seeing is sort of this race to the bottom in terms of tariffs and industrial policy. So, in my view, these developments were to be expected, and these developments will matter enormously for Europe. Why? Because when you make choices on industrial policy, you actually choose winners and losers. And in fact, industrial policy was out of fashion in the 80s and in the 90s because states have made the wrong bets and have wasted a lot of money on perhaps companies or sectors that were important politically, but were not champions economically. And this is very important for Europe at this moment, because Europe has to be united in order to weather the turbulence that can severely impact its security. Now, few things can divide so effectively as decisions on winners and losers in sectors and countries. So I will posit that any decision on industrial policy, and before the nomination of the current composition of the Commission, I very much supported the analysis that was done by the European Council on Foreign Relations that the Commission needed a geoeconomics commissioner. And for me, decisions on industrial policy will matter very much for growth, for defense, for the future of Europe, and for the security of the continent. So there are 4 principles that I believe the European Union and European Union member states should keep in mind when taking any decision on distribution of money that will in effect be industrial policy, or at least the most important decisions. One is any decision should maintain unity and cohesion to strengthen the Union and the single market. So, as the EU pursues more active policies in response to these geopolitical and geoeconomic challenges, it must balance national and union interests to avoid fragmentation. When I speak to private companies, I tell them that now is the time to seriously consider previous practices on lobbying and to think always about what is the common security interest. This will matter very much in the next year or 2 for Europe. Second principle, so first principle is always think what it will do to European Union. I mean, this is easier said than done, of course, and it requires difficult negotiations. But I think everybody will have to sort of find a common ground and maybe sometimes cede for this higher purpose goal. The second principle is to ensure transparency and accountability. Again, I think this can help a lot with trust. I talked last time when I was here for an ICD event about disinformation. And to me, the main objective of disinformation is erosion of trust. And liberal democracies can only work on the basis of trust. I have worked for private sector companies in the West, and I can tell you that it's much more effective to create a consortium or to do contracting in the West than it is in Moldova or some of the other countries that I've worked in, because people trust each other and trust institutions, and they can even make agreements on email rather than go through very complicated, very, lawyer-heavy agreements. So we need to make sure that we continue to foster trust of the citizens and trust of governments. Transparency is very important for that, even if you have to make quick decision-making. In fact, I will argue that this helps with the quick decision-making. Third principle is flexibility and adaptability. And I actually don't think that this is this goes against sort of the first 2 principles. And I do think that transparency allows for feedback that can help countries quickly pivot if they have made the right choice. If you look at the literature on industrial policy, then one can see that it's not about whether governments have made the wrong bets. It's about how quickly they can pivot away from wrong bets after it's discovered that they are not working in the way that they're intended. And then finally, I'm on the board of the National Bank. I have to say this. If you look at the literature, you cannot have an industrial policy, which is, really a micro policy, without having a sound macroeconomic system. So we should still think about inflation and financial stability. I will argue that we need new tools to think about inflation because they are not sort of traditionally demand-driven like they were. They can be driven by supply chain considerations, these industrial policy considerations, geo-economic challenges, expectations, trust and confidence. So, but we need to ensure that we don't see this massive volatility, particularly because of inflationary expectation. When I was in office, we had massive stagflation, and it was because of the invasion of Russia into Ukraine and the loss of supply chains and so on. But this is actually sort of having multiple impacts that are difficult to overcome, even if it only lasts temporarily. Because we all know that, you know, if a company fails in that moment, if it has, you know, 1 or 3 difficult months, after that it might not recover. So in conclusion, I believe that if we are talking about economics, we have to recognize that economics has become geoeconomics. We have to think very proactively about decisions that are made by governments that constitute industrial policy. And in Europe, this active thinking about industrial policy considerations and objectives can have a very important effect on European unity and European strategic autonomy. Thank you very much.